Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 192, A People's Guide to Greater Boston. Hi, I'm Jake. In just a few minutes, I'm going to be joined by two of the three authors of a new book that's launching this week called A People's Guide to Greater Boston. As the title implies, it's a guidebook, similar to Lonely Planet or Photos. But instead of giving an overview of the Freedom Trail and introducing readers to the hot restaurants and hotels of Boston, this guidebook uncovers the forgotten stories of radicals and activists hidden away in every neighborhood and suburb. For the listeners who complain that our normal episodes are too political, or our point of view is too liberal, well, sorry in advance, I guess. This guide definitely doesn't keep politics out of history, and its authors are starting from a point well to my left. But before we meet Joe Nevins and Suren Moodliar, it's time for this week's upcoming historical event. For my upcoming event this week, I'm featuring a talk by Dr. Richard Bell of the University of Maryland, hosted by the Boston Athenaeum. By now, listeners probably know that I'm a big Hamilton nerd. Now, I've seen the musical twice, and the soundtrack's in pretty heavy rotation in my earbuds. If you listen to our episode 62, about a peculiar duel between Bostonians, you've heard us badly violate Lin-Manuel's copyrights as well. Landing just in time for the Hamilton movie's debut on Disney+, this week's virtual event is titled Hamilton: How the Musical Remixes American History. Here's how the Athenaeum describes it. Even in lockdown, America has Hamilton mania. With Disney Plus streaming the show this July, everyone's talking about Lin-Manuel Miranda's Tony-winning musical. Its crafty lyrics, hip-hop tunes, and big, bold story have even rejuvenated interest in the real lives and true histories that Hamilton the Musical puts center stage. In this talk, University of Maryland historian Dr. Richard Bell will explore this musical phenomenon to reveal what its success tells us about the marriage of history and show business. We'll learn what this amazing musical gets right and gets wrong about Alexander Hamilton, the American Revolution, and the birth of the United States, and about why all that matters. We'll examine some of the choices Hamilton's creators made to simplify, dramatize, and humanize the complicated events and stories on which the show is based. We'll also talk about Hamilton's cultural impact. What does its runaway success reveal about the stories we tell each other about who we are and the nation we made? This Thursday, July 9th, you can tune into the talk at 6 p.m. The event's free, but you need to register in advance to get the connection details. We'll have a link in this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/192. Before I introduce my guests, I'd like to pause and thank our Patreon sponsors. These are the folks who sign up to give us $2, $5, or even $10 a month to help support the show. Along with offsetting the day-to-day expenses of podcasting, our Patreon supporters have helped us make some welcome improvements. Early on, we were able to upgrade our microphones, and over the past year or so, we've upgraded our media hosting in order to get into Spotify, added transcripts for deaf or hard-of-hearing Boston history nerds, subscribed to the Boston Globe archives for nearly 150 years of research material, and gotten expanded access to JSTOR for scholarly papers. All of that is due to your support, and we hope to keep making improvements going forward. Thanks to everyone who already supports the show. If you're not already a sponsor and you'd like to be, just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again. And now it's time for this week's main topic. A People's Guide to Greater Boston was written by Joseph Nevins, Suren Moodliar, and Eleni Makrakis. Joe, now a professor of geography at Vassar College, was born and raised in Dorchester. He's the author of past books on violence in East Timor, U.S. immigration in the apartheid era, and the recent remaking of the U.S.-Mexico boundary. Suren Moodliar grew up in South Africa and now lives in Chelsea. He's the coordinator of the movement building space Encuentro Cinco. He's also the editor of the journal Socialism and Democracy and a past collaborator with Noam Chomsky. Eleni Makrakis grew up in Cambridge and now works on affordable housing development in Greater Boston. Their new book is A Radical's Guide to Boston and the Surrounding Suburbs. It's organized first geographically, then topically. It has sections covering Boston's urban core, the neighborhoods, adjoining towns like Cambridge and Chelsea, and then the North Shore, South Shore, and Metro West. In each section, the authors unearth a wide range of sites, and in some cases, former sites, that are tied to Black, indigenous, labor, or other radical historic events. After the sections group by geography, there are a half-dozen thematic tours, tying together sites from around the region that are all related to a single historic topic. These include Native Boston, Malcolm and Martin, Sacco and Vanzetti, Bread and Roses, The 1%, and a nature tour. Joe and Suren are joining me now to talk about A People's Guide to Greater Boston. Joe and Suren, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
The book is A People's Guide to Greater Boston. And I guess my first question about it is, who do you envision this book being for? Is it written for an audience of native Bostonians, for first-time visitors, or for somebody else, somebody somewhere in between?
You know, when you write a book with the title that contains the word "A People's Guide," I think at some moments you entertain the fantasy that it's speaking to absolutely everyone. Anyone who would want to define themselves as part of the people. However, in the sort of early stages of the book, I think we decided we wanted to reach people who were making social change or interested in social change or connected to or feel sympathy with people who desire social change and changing the relations between the powerful and those afflicted by power. And so I think that, that sort of is a large category that speaks to who we'd like to reach. So it does mean reaching students on campuses, workers in unions or non-union workers, and a wide range of other people, although we do, I think, assume a fair amount of education on behalf of the reader.
I guess the title is a little bit of a dead giveaway by sort of the nod to Howard Zinn and the People's History of the United States. It gives folks an idea of what the point of view is. So because it's a guidebook, it is arranged a little bit differently than a typical, I guess, a narrative history book. Can one of you tell us a little bit about how the book's structured?
Well, the book is very historical, right? It covers about 400 years. The way it's organized is more geographical. So the book is both a guidebook of sorts, and it's also a historical geography. And when we say it's geographical, it's organized on the basis of places, right? So the book opens in the historic core of the city of Boston and then moves out into the neighborhoods and then moves to municipalities in and around the city of Boston proper. So we go from places like Cambridge and Somerville, right? Places that one normally thinks of as part of Greater Boston, but then places that are farther afield, places like Lawrence and Lynn and Lowell, Salem, Plymouth and Concord. And partly what we're trying to do is to help to shed light on parts of Greater Boston that are typically neglected when one thinks about Boston's historical geography, and at the same time to highlight the fact that while there are boundaries between these different municipalities and these different neighborhoods and sections of the greater urban area, there are also a lot of connections, right? And those connections are formulated and struggled over in all sorts of ways. And those formulations and struggles are central to what we're trying to bring to light through this book.
The book spends a lot of time, as you say, on the historic core and the neighborhoods of Boston, but it ranges from Haverhill to Brockton, out to Concord. How did you decide where to draw the line in terms of what counted as Greater Boston for the purposes of the book?
Well, let me just say that wasn't an easy process. Right? Part of the struggle in writing any book, and certainly this book, is trying to figure out what to include. And equally important, and that's in an effort to produce a book like this, is to figure out what not to include. And so one of the discussions that we had a number of times is, how do we define Greater Boston? And where we ultimately decided is we were going to define it by largely through the MBTA, right? But then, that can take you pretty far, right? Especially in terms of the commuter rail. It can take you places like Worcester and things like that. We didn't go that far, right? We tended to places that were relatively easily accessible from the city of Boston through public transportation, right? But, some of the places like Plymouth are not so easy to reach.
Right.
But so ultimately, in deciding to include a place like Plymouth, it emerged out of our recognition, if you will, that to not include Plymouth, given its importance in terms of colonial and indigenous historical geographies, would just leave a sort of a gaping hole in the story that we're trying to tell. At the same time, and we're very explicit about this in the book, what we're not trying to do in this book is to be comprehensive, right? We're trying to be suggestive. A geographical story is in some way, it doesn't lend itself to the neatness that a historical narrative does. And so in picking and choosing what to include, we left holes in the story. And we see this not as the end of a conversation, but as one intervention in an ongoing dialogue about the making of a people's Greater Boston.
Yeah, it's a question that I struggle with the podcast. What stories do I include in the podcast? And when we first started almost 4 years ago now, I would say, oh, well, that was in Cambridge. I don't know. That's not really Boston. And now I'm trying to convince myself whether a really fascinating sounding book about a New Bedford whaler, trying to decide, well, is New Bedford Boston enough? So my circle has gotten ever bigger over the past few years of doing this podcast.
That was really a challenge for us too, thinking specifically about places like Fall River, New Bedford, given the history, people like in the Underground Railroad, in Frederick Douglass's life and all. And ultimately we decided most people just didn't think of New Bedford as part of Boston. And so that was difficult. Another sort of entry point into this was to look at the sort of life of people who we were writing about, and when we thought of people like Sacco and Vanzetti, for example, they lived all over, the map of what we'd call Greater Boston and beyond that too. And they got around, literally on the same day to these different parts of the city, in addition to living in these different areas. And so there is a functional Greater Boston in a sense. And I think that we certainly don't cover it comprehensively, as Joe pointed out, but we do have a sense of what's in it, and I think that the different cities we've chosen sort of capture the circumference of that area.
Now, coming back to a comment that Joe made about Plymouth and the importance of including Plymouth, in part because of its centrality in indigenous history of the Boston area. I guess it's no accident that the introduction to the book is titled Unsettling Greater Boston. I read a double meaning into that title. What were you getting at by beginning your guidebook to Boston by talking about Boston as a product of colonization?
So certainly, Jake, you're correct in that we purposefully wanted to communicate a double meaning. Right? We want to unsettle, if you will, received wisdom about what Boston was and is and how it came to be what we know today, or I should say Greater Boston. And at the same time, we want to think of the process of colonization, right? And if you look at the root of the word colonization, the etymology of the term, right, it's about settlement. Right? And we want to think about that process of settlement, particularly European settlement, and how that, the work that did and the work that built upon, right? And particularly the presence of non-European peoples, specifically, the indigenous or native population. At the same time, in thinking about Boston as a colonial enterprise, we want to think about it both as a site that was and is colonized, in a broad sense, but also a place that participated in and continues in a broader colonial project, right? That has both national and global dimensions. So when we think about, for example, the U.S. Conquest of Hawaii, or we think of the U.S. annexation of what's today the U.S. Southwest through the U.S.-Mexican War of 1846 to 1848, by which the U.S. took about what was, at least nominally, then almost half of Mexican territory. Mm-hmm. If we think about the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, and the taking of the Philippines and Cuba, right? Affluent and influential Greater Bostonians played central roles in this. And still today, Boston's a city that's known as a place with a significant peace and anti-militarism movement, but Boston is also central to the military-industrial complex, right? And if we think about, for example, the war in Yemen that continues to unfold, Raytheon Corporation in Waltham is a central player in that, right? And so we want to bring together these different strands, if you will, of the colonial project, both Greater Boston as a place of settlement, and Greater Boston and the institutions and individuals associated with it as a place that produces a larger colonial project. And of course, at the same time, a place in which this colonial project, in its different facets, is challenged in very important ways over time.
It's funny you mentioned the the annexation of Hawaii. I was on Maui a few years back, and there just seemed to be a congregational church on every corner. And of course, that's the missionary movement that was based out of Park Street Church. But I wasn't really aware of that at the time until I came back and said, why are all these congregational churches everywhere on Maui? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, if you go to the Green Street T station, within about a 5 or 10 minute walk from that station, you'll come to the stately home of the Dole family.
Oh.
And yes, and they were a unit. I think the father of the family was a very progressive Unitarian Universalist minister. His son went off to Harvard, and I think he might have studied like plant botany or something like that, and helped create the plantation agricultural system in Hawaii that gave its name to the Dole Corporation that we now know.
The introduction to the book, as you say, it focuses on the colonial project, especially during the settlement period of Boston. And then you transition from that into the first few sites in your section on Boston's urban core. And either the first or one of the first stops on your tour of Boston is Deer Island. And for most people today, Deer Island is known as the site of the massive waste digesters, the sewage digesters. They're visible from around the harbor, from the Blue Hills, from any place where you can get a vantage on the harbor. But back in the 17th century, that same site was basically an internment camp for the praying Indians. So will you give us a little background on why we call them praying Indians and how the camps there came to be?
The camps on Deer Island are extremely interesting for precisely the group of people you're talking about, the praying Indians. And they represent an interesting category of people, as it were, because they were a group of people who essentially collaborated with the settlers and adopted Christianity and adopted many of its practices and lived in very defined settlements. And in our book, we have several of them: the Wamisit settlement in Lowell, Nonantum in Brighton, and we mentioned Natick as well. And as a group of people who collaborated, it seems like they occupied an ambiguous relationship both with respect to the settlers and to other indigenous people who refused to collaborate. At the same time, just want to emphasize this word ambiguity, because till today, there's no real settled perspective on whether these were people who had genuinely given up their indigenous beliefs, or if they had, in a very calculating way, decided to collaborate in order that they could stay on their land or stay on land close to where they once had lived. In the case of Nonantum, these were people who worked with John Eliot, after whom John Eliot Square is named, and they converted to Christianity and were then settled in 1646 in the area known as Nonantum, and within 5 years they were moved off that land that they had been allocated further out of Boston to Natick. And so one of the stories we tell is of people marking this movement by paddling downriver from Natick on the Charles all the way through to the bay, and to ultimately land at Deer Island. During King Philip's War, the praying Indians were seen as a hostile party and removed from their lands, transferred from their lands, much as say Israeli settlers desire to transfer Palestinians from their lands today. And so they were interred on the islands in 1675 in the course of what is today called King Philip's War, and subject to deportation from there. They were also left, we say an internment camp, but it was also a place where they were effectively starved while on the island in winter. And so it has a very ugly history that perpetuated itself long after that layer of people were vanquished. So after that, it was a place where people were interred in the late 1800s at least, in an attempt to isolate people who were suspected of having smallpox. The island was used for that purpose as well, as a quarantine area. Irish people were quarantined there in the 1840s, and then in the 1920s, socialists were interred there before being deported. So that history continues. I'll just give you a very different perspective on Deer Island from what we even have in the book and tell you my own perspective on it. Sure. I first learned about Deer Island for the very same reason you cited at the beginning, thinking about the large water treatment facility there. And the reason I came to think about it is it's a multi-billion-dollar facility, and it was itself a product of an urban struggle here over Boston Harbor, and in order that Boston Harbor be cleaned up. So it was created, and when it was created, a bond was taken out, which the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority has to service, and it's serviced through user fees, and the result is that water rates in Boston are relatively high compared to the rest of the country, and those high water costs result in racial inequality across the city, where black Boston is 10 times more likely to have their water shut off than white Boston. And so Deer Island also has that meaning for me too. It's a symbol of a particular type of investment in a particular type of technology that costs the city in terms of social inequality and literally in terms of monthly bills. So Deer Island doesn't have a happy history as far as I'm concerned.
No, and there's a lot there that I had never thought to unpack. I've never compared Boston's water rates to other major cities to even realize they were high. While we're on the topic of indigenous history, I'm going to fast forward through history and also through the book a bit. There was a story I'd never read anywhere else before about the Odeon Theater and a speech that was given there in 1836 that harkened back to that settlement period and King Philip's War itself. Who was speaking then in 1836?
The person speaking was William Apes, and his name might be pronounced Apes. I really haven't come across a single settled spelling or pronunciation of the name. And his own autobiography is simply his name, William Apes, and then a comma, Pequot. So he's a descendant of Pequot indigenous peoples. The first war that the settlers had was with the Pequot Indians. The first war that Massachusetts Bay Colony engaged in 1636. And so William Apes was certainly someone who traveled the area and developed a pan-Indian identity. So rather than an individual tribal identity, he articulated a sort of a broader history of indigenous people sharing a common experience. In fact, just before he came to make that speech at the Odeon Theatre, he had participated in the Mashpee uprising in 1833, 1834, in which what was then a reservation rose up against their trusteeship, which was exercised through Harvard University, and sought greater autonomy. This is the same group of people who the Trump administration is currently challenging, or at least a part of the same nation, the Wampanoag, whom the Trump administration is challenging over their rights to territory today. What is interesting about William Apes is he's in developing this pan-European identity, he also saw himself as an historian, and he used history for political purposes in a very self-conscious way. So his speech at the Odeon Theatre was called A Vindication of King Philip. And he, in the speech, engages in a sort of a study of European encounters with native peoples from the point of view of native peoples. But he had a very immediate practical purpose for harkening back to more than 100 years before, to King Philip's War, which was at about the same time the government of Andrew Jackson was engaged in carrying out the plans of the Indian Removal Act. And so there was a nationwide movement against people being expelled from Florida and from what is present-day Georgia. And this also speaks to his pan-Indian identity. So there are many themes that come together with William Apes. Another element of this, the intersectionality of all of this, that speech that day on January 8th, 1836, it was advertised in the Liberator published by William Lloyd Garrison. And so there's a great sense of overlap of struggle and an identity of struggles, on the one hand, with Garrison's advocating for immediate abolition of slavery, and vindicating King Philip and reaffirming the rights of indigenous people to their lands against a government very much like today's.
Where was the Odeon Theatre? Was it in what's today Chinatown?
No, actually, it's in it's one federal place. So very close to Liberty Square down in the financial district.
Liberty Square would have been the site of the Liberty Tree, and then, of course, after that, the Liberty Stump after the British cut it down. But you don't focus on the Revolutionary era when you talk about Liberty Square. You talk about a celebration in 1793. So what was happening during Washington's administration that was resulting in this big party in Liberty Square?
I should say this was a huge learning exercise for me. For about 10 years, my office was about 2 blocks from the site of the Liberty Tree, which was in Chinatown, right? However, Liberty Square is in the financial district.
Oh, okay. I'm confusing the two.
Yep, and I was just as confused. So that was the first place I went to research Liberty Square, and eventually walked, about a mile or so in the opposite direction. So this Liberty Square was very close to what would have been the waterfront in that period, right? Mm-hmm. And it was also the site of an action against the Stamp Act in 1765. So it's a site that has great resonance for the official narratives of the American Revolution. The revolt against the Stamp Act, was part of sort of the growing awareness of the English in America, that they were more American than they were English. And so the site has great resonance for that meaning, or great valence for that kind of question. But in the early 1790s, there was still a lot of debate as to what the nature of the American Republic would be. It was just 4 years since the coup d'etat that created the present U.S. Constitution as something that supplanted the Articles of Confederation. And so there's still a lot of questions about the legitimacy of this form of government and this constitution. And high on the minds of people, and was a sense that this was still a revolutionary era, and that there was extreme social inequality in not only the city of Boston, but pretty much everywhere else. The afterglow of the revolution certainly had worn off. It had been quite a few years since 1776. And so in response to the sense of inequality, many people throughout the United States, the 13 colonies, looked abroad at the French Revolution as an example of dealing not only with the question of political liberty, but more substantive questions of socio-economic freedom and equality. And so the French Revolution caused great consternation in the ranks of the American ruling elite. People like Thomas Jefferson and all celebrated it, and were actually, witnesses to much of it, whereas people like Boston's John Adams and Washington and all looked upon it with suspicion. And so the events that are celebrated at Liberty Square, January 24th, 1793, was a celebration of the victory at the Battle of Valmy in late December of the French revolutionaries against the Prussian troops. And so it was a huge celebration. Everyone celebrated it, except that people sang French revolutionary songs. They engaged in parades and feasts, and they left the official celebrations and celebrated more broadly, including at the site of the old Liberty Tree in Chinatown, stopping there and having another feast and meeting and sort of constituting a more multiracial crowd than the white crowd gathered at Liberty Square. So Liberty Square, has this very subversive meaning to it, and in some ways, the present celebration of Liberty Square gives you no sense that this was a site of class conflict in that period, and it wasn't merely the fact that Boston in that period had the largest pro-French Revolution demonstrations anywhere outside of France, right? But that in fact, this was a critique of what was happening in the United States at the same time.
Now, staying within that urban core, sort of the first section of the book, there's another forgotten chapter just down the road a piece in the North End, and you frame it around what was once an armory on Cooper Street. And it culminates in a riot, and it culminates with the militia firing a cannon at a crowd of civilians. But the morning starts, it seems very simply, trying to serve draft notices in the tenements in the North End. How did we get from a normal, calm morning to essentially state violence against a crowd of civilians that afternoon?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you're referring to this massacre that took place in July 1863 on Cooper Street at the corner with North Margin. And if you go there today, you're going to find a parking lot. No sign, no marker indicating of what transpired there in 1863. A lot of people are familiar with the New York draft riots, but they're not familiar with the Boston draft riot. The New York draft riot took place just a few days before the Boston draft riot. So what took place in New York was in the air. And at the time, the North End had a huge Irish-descended population. We tend to think of the North End in terms of Italians, but many types of people have lived in the North End over time. And in the mid-1800s, it had a very significant Irish population, right? There were about 50,000 Irish immigrants living in Boston at that time. And this is out of a total population of a little over 180,000. And the North End was one of the two largest enclaves. As a largely impoverished population, as a working class population, not surprisingly, the Irish became, sort of the demographic resource, if you will, for the Union Army. Mm-hmm. And so they made up a disproportionate number of the troops that came out of Massachusetts. And as a result, they also experienced a disproportionate amount of the casualties. At the same time, there were heavy economic consequences in terms of the this over-reliance, if you will, on Irish soldiers A lot of the breadwinners, if you will, of families in the North End were lost to the war effort. And so people who were engaged in recruiting and serving draft notices were often not very popular. And so that morning, a couple of officials came and they tried to serve notices on Prince Street. And they were rebuffed by a woman who, and the story goes, tried to assault one of the officials. And the officials tried to arrest her. Right? And that led to this confrontation outside the Cooper Street Armory. And the estimate is somewhere between 500 to 1,000 individuals, many of them women and children, tore up bricks from the street, and they were hurling them at the building and smashing windows and, splintering pieces off the huge double doors. And at that point, and some of the rioters had firearms and other weapons, homemade weapons. And at that point, the commanding officer of the militia members inside wheeled one of the armory's cannons, filled it with buckshot, and wheeled it to the entrance and fired through the doors and killed. No one really knows for sure. The estimates run typically from 8 to 14 people. Even though Irish Bostonians played a big role in the Union war effort, people of Irish descent were ambivalent at best about the Civil War. They supported it largely in the name of the preservation of the Union, not in the name of emancipation of enslaved people. Right? So a lot of people were actually opposed to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And if you go back and read like the Irish newspapers of the time or Catholic newspapers, say the Boston Pilot, which is still the Archdiocese of Boston's weekly newspaper, they used openly racist language trying to convince white people against the idea of equality of the African descended population. But what this episode illuminates is the class tensions, if you will, in addition to racial tensions that were at the heart of sort of the making of the war, if you will, right? The making of the war in the sense of raising an army.
I guess the flip side of the anti-draft riots was the fact that there were African Americans who were dying to participate in the war and fight for the Union and fight, more importantly, for emancipation. And one of the sites we have in the book is Camp Meigs, which is in Hyde Park, and was the site of the training ground for the Massachusetts 54th. I think there's an interesting story about how African Americans came to be at least 10% of the Union Army, whereas at the start of the war they weren't allowed to fight at all. And in that conversation, there's a lot of you see history being put to practical political use in order to argue for African American participation in the war as soldiers rather than merely as teamsters carrying weaponry and supplies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so what was that conversation? How did history play into the debate around starting the first volunteer regiments of African Americans?
Certainly African Americans were excluded from the beginning, and one of the arguments made is that African American soldiers were good enough for General Washington but not for General McClellan, who was for the beginning of the Civil War the commander of all the armed forces on the Union side. That's one way in which past African involvement in the liberation of this country from the British, if one works with that narrative, was marshaled to argue for participation as soldiers in the Union forces. But for Lincoln, it was a very complex question. He was constantly triangulating, trying to maintain the border states' support in the war, and he felt that if he inducted African Americans into the Union armed forces as full soldiers, he would lose the border states like parts of North Carolina, Kentucky, and even Tennessee, which went over to the last state to join the Confederates. And so he delayed and procrastinated on this involvement, even though he met twice with people like Frederick Douglass to discuss this. However, by the second meeting, he's ready to involve African Americans, particularly in light of the fact that war casualties were so heavy and that there was growing draft resistance throughout the country. And so following on that meeting, Douglass gave his commitment to recruit people, including his own son, into the 54th, into the Massachusetts 54th, which trained at Camp Meigs. And when they left Reedville Station for downtown Boston and the State House, 1,000 of them, to parade past the State House, they also went by the site of the Boston Massacre of 1770, and to sort of call attention to Crispus Attucks as both Native American and African American, was the first life sort of lost in the American Revolution. But that whole rescuing of Crispus Attucks as a historical figure came about in that period because an African American historian, William Nell, recovered that history and emphasized it. And so that's where we see sort of history being deployed to tell stories for very instrumental political purposes, and in this case, to defeat the Confederate South, something that seems, is being played out again.
Well, as long as we're moving out of the immediate, quote, historic core of Boston into some of the neighborhoods. One neighborhood that makes a pretty strong showing in the book is Roxbury and the sort of lower Roxbury in the South End. And one of the fascinating sites that you talk about in the book is Denison House. Now, we've mentioned Denison House a little bit on the show before, just in the context of Amelia Earhart's work there. Can you introduce us to what a settlement house would have been in the early 20th century, what made them important, and then among settlement houses, what made Denison House special?
So when people hear about settlement houses, often, to the extent they're familiar with them, probably what comes to mind is Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago. Mm-hmm. But there are a number of them in and around Boston. And Denison House is probably the most well-known of those. It was founded in 1892 in today what's called Chinatown or the South Cove on Tyler Street. And they were typically establishments that had been set up by middle class or, individuals, professional individuals, middle class institutions in working class or heavily immigrant neighborhoods. And the goal was to, settle, if you will, right? Well-educated, upper middle class people among the working poor so that they could be studied, right? The working poor could be studied, and also to help, quote unquote, uplift them through the examples of, the upper middle class people who were setting this up. Right? In the case of the Denison House, the three founders were all college professors, right? One was at Wellesley. They were all from Wellesley College, right? An English professor and labor activist by the name of Vita Scudder, and economics professors Catherine Coleman and Emily Green Balch, who was a very well-known peace activist. In part, what makes Denison House interesting, it was much more radical and sort of it pushed the envelope a lot more than most settlement houses, and that reflected the politics of the founders. And so, while at Denison House, people, particularly women, could take courses on literature and carpentry and nursing, and they had summer camps for children. They had a library, a clinic. It was also a meeting place for those who were interested in the causes of socialism and pacifism and the labor movement more broadly. And this greatly upset many of the donors who tended to be males. You mentioned, in terms of some of the famous residents and workers there, Amelia Earhart, but another one was Mary Kennedy O'Sullivan. And she was a labor organizer and one of the founders of the Women's Trade Union League. Denison House, it grew. It eventually encompassed several houses in a row on Tyler Street in Chinatown. But as it became more institutionalized, its core as sort of a women's run organization decreased. And so and that changed its politics. So around World War II in 1942, it shut down in Chinatown and it moved to Dorchester. It merged with other settlement houses there, and they now exist as part of what's known as the Federated Dorchester Neighborhood Houses.
Yeah, Denison House as a woman-led and founded organization at the time it was founded is very interesting to me.
Earlier, Suren used the word intersectionality. And this is something that was, I think, really interesting that we discovered for ourselves as we were doing research on this book, is that all sorts of people were working on all sorts of causes, across the centuries. And so that women were involved in the founding of Denison House actually, in some ways, is not surprising at all. Right? Women played leading roles in all sorts of movements in the 19th and 18th and 17th centuries. And we saw that not only in Boston proper, but we saw it in places like Lynn, with the Lynn Female Anti-Slavery Society, was really pushing the envelope, not only against slavery, but against all racial barriers. In Lowell, in terms of the labor movement in the 19th century, I mean, there are many examples. And so what took place in Denison House in some ways emerges out of this larger ecology, if you will, of people working on all sorts of different issues and at many intersections.
So right down the street, not so much from Denison House, neither of its incarnations, but from South End House and some of its contemporaries in the early 20th century settlement house movement, is Haley House. Can you tell us a little bit about what the founding and mission of Haley House is compared to some of the earlier settlement houses?
Am I taking that, Suren, or you?
Well, why did you do it, Joe?
We divided things up, Jake, and I think I got this one, and I forgot that I got it. So anyway.
Well, actually, before we talk about Haley House, that actually brings us to an interesting question that maybe I should have asked earlier. How did you end up working on this project as three co-authors? And were there any challenges with too many cooks in the kitchen, or was it different than other projects you've worked on by having a group authorship?
Well, we fought a lot. That's the next book, right? This book grows out of a series, right? And until the publication of the Boston book, it was a series of one. And the first book was A People's Guide to Los Angeles, and the book did very well. And as a result of that, the University of California Press commissioned a series. And so there are a number of these People's Guide books that are unfolding. Right, there's one coming out very soon after Oz on the San Francisco Bay Area. The next one will be New York City. There's one on Nashville. There's one on Orange County, California. So there's a number of them. But when Laura Polito, the lead author of the Los Angeles book, asked me if I knew anyone that could do the Boston book, because they wanted to have something on Boston. And being very immodest, I immediately thought of myself, but I knew I couldn't do it by myself. And I immediately thought of Suren as a potential co-author. And so I called Suren, and Suren immediately expressed interest. And at that time, Eleni Makrakis was a senior at Vassar College, and she was taking a class with me. Eleni is born and raised in Cambridge. And we connected, given her interest on things Greater Boston. And it was very clear that she was someone who not only was really interested in the city, but engaged it in a very active way. And so we asked her to serve as our research assistant. And she did a fantastic job as a research assistant. She did a lot more than simply do what we asked her to do. I mean, she made the project her own. And in doing so, helped to, create things that we wouldn't have imagined or been able to do about, on our own. So we asked her to then become an author. In terms of how and why we divided things up in ways we did, I mean, as you might have gotten from, Suren's discussion of Camp Meigs or on Liberty Square and things like that, Suren has a fascination and a deep knowledge on things related to the Revolutionary War, and particularly the Civil War and abolitionism, right? And so he tended in that direction in ways that, I didn't, for example. And there are, I have particular interests and bodies of knowledge and things I'm familiar with that, lent themselves more to my focusing on them than, say, Eleni, and vice versa. And so in some ways, the division of labor emerged organically. And at the same time, sometimes it simply became a function of what one was able to do at a particular time. And so, as we were learning more, as we were trying to imagine the book as a whole, we identified holes or things that we, thought were important, but we weren't covering, and would, say like, who can do this? And, sometimes it was based on who was available.
It's sort of a related question that is similar to how the book came about, and the question about division of labor is we ended up writing about over 200 different sites, and then we had to narrow those down to a manageable amount. Certainly one that would keep us within the 100,000 word limit that the press had established. And that was a task that I dreaded. And yet when we got together, Joe proposed a very simple methodology, right? List all the ones you think definitely have to be in, and then list the ones that you think maybe, and then we'll compare the lists. And so immediately, once we identified the overlaps, those would definitely be in. And then we looked at the maybes, and there was a fair amount of convergence, even if it meant at times each of us having to give up some sites that we really fell in love with. And so it was a very sort of truly collegial, collaborative process. And I think that the fact that we were constantly learning about new things and developed questions along the way sort of left us with a very pragmatic attitude toward the history. One, we would never be comprehensive. We would never get to say the final word about any particular site. So let's work with this and issue it into the world as part of a continuing stream of conversations.
So sorry about the diversion there. That's something I had meant to ask at the top of the show. I was just starting to ask about how Haley House, being founded sort of in mid-20th century era, would have been different from settlement houses of the earlier century.
So the Haley House grew out of, first of all, the Haley House it's like an intentional living community of individuals dedicated to social justice. So in that sense, it resonates, if you will, with the spirit of Denison House. It has different roots. It emerges out of the Catholic worker movement, right, which is it still exists today, founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Marin, a group of radical Catholics dedicated to peace and anti-militarism and social justice and simple living. And the Catholic worker movement is a collection of autonomous communities that actively oppose war and poverty. And so different Catholic worker communities in different cities do different things. And in Boston, what they do through the Haley House is they operate a daily soup kitchen that provides breakfast for men. And in the afternoon, they provide elder meals, regardless of gender. And then they also have a food pantry for neighborhood families and elders. And since its original establishment in the mid-1960s, Haley House has expanded what it does. It owns and manages over 100 affordable housing units, and it also it has a community garden in Roxbury, and it also has a bakery cafe in Dudley Square or Nubian Square that runs a catering business, and it's a profit sharing establishment that not only works to pay a living wage, but it also provides training jobs to individuals who, for a whole variety of reasons, face major obstacles to finding employment. Haley House, in the South End, and Haley House in Dudley or Nubian Square serve as important centers of sort of left and progressive and peace activism in the city of Boston, and they've done that for the Haley House has done that for the last 50 years or so.
Now, staying in the South End for a moment, I want to talk about a riot. And I know our listeners are probably sick of hearing me say that, because whenever I am stuck for a topic to talk about on the podcast, I just flip through Boston history and there's always a good riot to talk about. But I've never talked specifically about the so-called Puerto Rican riots that swept through several New England cities in the 1970s. And it's embodied here in Boston in the 1972 Puerto Rican Festival in Blackstone Square. What led up to a moment of unrest that gets remembered, whether rightly or not, as the Puerto Rican riots of 1972.
As with most sort of urban uprisings and civil conflict, the exact origins are murky. It includes the fact that some sort of scuffle broke out and someone used a starter pistol, the kind of thing used in athletics, to sort of interrupt the process. And that sort of brought the police in, leading to 3 days of skirmishes and 36 arrests, a large number of injuries. And so there was this riot, as was characterized at the time, in Blackstone Square. One of the things that was interesting to us was to try to look at an event like that and go beyond the immediate item that becomes newsworthy and try to understand the community in which this event occurred. And it did, in fact, as most civil conflict today does, result in increased attention to the community. The fact that there was 32% unemployment in the area at that time among Puerto Rican community. There was also a time when there were other kinds of organizing happening, in the same community. In fact, some of the meetings that happened during the so-called riot were in Via Victoria. And so there was that kind of organizing happening to create Via Victoria in that period. But in addition to that, there was also a stronger current than, say, a 501c non-profit type project there, right? And that was the fact that the Puerto Rican Socialist Party was very influenced and grew out of the Puerto Rican independence movement, and had and something that had strong ties back to Puerto Rico itself, was active in the area, and they had established a nucleo within that community and took on the issue of police violence against the community as one of the grievances that they wanted to organize to address. And so these other kinds of developments beyond the riot are also interesting to us. The development of an independent ideology from the dominant ideology of assimilation and incorporation, instead an ideology of independence and social equality. And I think that's something that persists through to the present. So, with every catastrophe that has struck Puerto Rico in recent years, including most importantly fiscal austerity, as deadly as any hurricane or earthquake, you find that the entire Puerto Rican diaspora sort of not only receives new people, but that kind of radicalism from the island spreads out across the east coast of the United States. So for us, the interesting thing about Blackstone Square in this period was an independent political formation.
Also community building embodied in Via Victoria, which you name checked, but for the listeners, will you explain a little bit about what Via Victoria is?
Via Victoria emerges in the late 1960s out of a project of urban planning aid, which is a group of urban planners and community residents who were addressing, these very problems that we mentioned earlier, things like unemployment, but specifically the landlord-tenant relationship and the fact that many of the homes in the area were quite dilapidated and there was a high density of residents in these homes and consequent other social ills in the space as well. And so Via Victoria is a project to provide that community with not only ownership over these dilapidated buildings, but to rehabilitate the buildings and create community institutions that reflect the needs of the community. In fact, the physical design of Via Victoria is inspired by a sort of rural Puerto Rican village, and the architects involved in it and selected to help develop it visited Puerto Rico in order to understand the physical dimensions of the community building project. It resulted in a project that persists through to the present with a whole range of organizations and activities, a community center, an arts center. For a while there was a radio station and a I don't think we have these anymore, info shops and that kind of thing. And so this was, a very comprehensive community development, unlike Denison House and others. This was very much a community-driven process, and so there wasn't any external tutelage of the community. At least that hasn't really surfaced as a complaint in what I've read.
One of the things that's interesting about the South End is, during the 60s and 70s and 80s was what a hotbed of organizing it was on many different fronts. Of course, the South End today is one of the most heavily gentrified neighborhoods in the city of Boston, and for most people, it's very unaffordable. Still, what's striking about the South End is there remains a significant working class, low income population, a significant population of color.
Large tracts of subsidized housing and public housing.
Yeah, and alternative forms of housing like Via Victoria. And these social struggles that, in some ways seem very remote help explain why we still see a significant amount of diversity, class-wise, ethno-racially, in the South End today, despite the power of gentrification and the affluent classes that are moving in there.
In a way, it's a little petri dish for the entire city as we struggle with housing affordability. And that same transformation seems evident to me is happening at different rates all over the city. East Boston, which has long been a working class immigrant neighborhood, going back, even when we talked about the Civil War period, and the North End at that time being very Irish. The East Boston's gone through all the same transformations. It was Yankee, and then it was Irish, and then it was Italian. Over the past couple of decades, it's been mostly Central American immigrants and their descendants. And now it's very rapidly gentrifying because people have discovered it's waterfront property.
Right.
I guess I could follow up with a question for you about East Boston. A site makes an appearance in the book that has, at least the modern incarnation of this site, has the amazing name Navy Fuel Pier Airport Edge Buffer. But before it had that name, it was the East Boston Immigration Station. Can you tell me what the role of the East Boston Immigration Station was in its heyday, and then why it makes an appearance in your book that's really about radical history?
Maybe we'll start off with its current name, or the Navy Fuel Pier Airport Edge Buffer. It's hard to imagine an uglier name for a park. But that that says a lot about East Boston. About 2/3 of East Boston is literally dedicated to Logan Airport. And so it's very difficult to understand East Boston without understanding the very dominant role, not only the airport, but especially the airport, but transportation infrastructure have been in transforming that community. The East Boston Immigration Station opened in 1920. It closed in 1954. People referred to it as Boston's Ellis Island. And during that period, 1920 to 1954, the East Boston Immigration Station processed about 10% of the immigrant arrivals that came through the port of Boston, which would include the airport, about 23,000 immigrants. And eventually Massport, which owns Logan Airport, acquired the site, and they tore it down in 2011 after deeming it unsalvageable, despite community protest. But the East Boston Immigration Station was important not only because of the numbers of people it processed, but it sheds light on sort of the purpose of immigration control in some ways, and social control more broadly. So in May 1932, 11 they called themselves hunger marchers gathered outside the immigration station. They were part of a much larger group that had descended on Boston to go to the State House from various locations around the state to call for unemployment relief. This is in the context, of course, of the Depression. And this breakoff group specifically went to East Boston because they wanted to protest the detention and the threatened deportation of Edith Berkman. Her nickname was the Red Flame. She was an organizer with the National Textile Workers Union, and they were actively engaged in a strike in Lawrence against the owners of the mills, the wool mills. Berkman was a Polish immigrant, and she was arrested for her alleged association with communists and by authorities in Lawrence. Again, she had been one of the key organizers of a strike in 1931. And this speaks to how the immigration station, among its functions, was processing people, but also it was a place of social control, particularly geared towards non-citizens who were defined or perceived as threats to the established order. And perhaps the most famous person ever to be detained there was, people are familiar with the Ponzi scheme, right? Well, Carlo or Charles Ponzi, the swindler, spent time at the East Boston Immigration Station. During World War II, it served as a prison for Germans and Italian soldiers captured at sea, and for also German, Italian, and Japanese so-called enemy aliens. So these are non-citizen residents of German and Italian and Japanese descent who were living in the United States. But, during the war, were seen as potentially suspect and thus were detained there. Apparently, Columbia Point in Dorchester was also a site for, certainly Italian POWs were held there. And reportedly some, people of Italian descent who were civilians as well.
I will say, as a piece of trivia and a teaser for the listeners for a future episode, Columbia Point during World War II was the site of, as far as I can tell, Boston's only soccer riot among the Italian prisoners who are being held there.
I look forward to that episode.
I'm going to start moving toward a wrap up. But before I do, I'll bring in one of the sites that has a lot of memory attached to it for me. It goes back to my early history here in Boston. And it's in Kenmore Square. Kenmore used to be basically anchored by an all-night diner called Deli House and a punk club called the Rathskeller. So can you tell us just a little bit about the Rat in its heyday and how Kenmore Square's changed since then?
Well, given what you've said, in some ways I want to talk about Deli House because I ate many meals there.
Oh, yeah.
And
I can talk about Deli House all night if you want. I like to get their potato pancakes with the applesauce. I like to sit as close as I could to the Velvet Elvis.
And in some ways, the presence of, places like Deli House and the Rat and the Army Navy store, that speaks to what Kenmore Square was during the 60s and the 70s and 80s. And it was sort of it was somewhat of a gritty or grungy area, very interesting and alternative space where all sorts of people would gather and connect. And, at the heart of it was the Rat. So in the 60s, what was the formal name of it was the Rathskeller. It was a rundown bar and restaurant, right on Comm Ave. Later, the history's a little fuzzy, but someone bought it and then it became known as TJ's. Then it got sold again, and in 1974, the new owner brought back the old name, the Rathskeller. And from then until 1997, the Rat, which was the name most of us knew it by, in addition to being a restaurant, it was really known as the center of Boston's punk and alternative rock scene. And bands like the Ramones and the Talking Heads and the Dead Kennedys, Metallica, the Police, the Beastie Boys, REM, they all played there. And then there were very popular Boston-based bands, the Pixies, the Cars, the Dropkick Murphys, played there. And, when it closed down in 1997, it was sad in the sense that it was the most painful manifestation, if you will, of, not only the change in the music scene, but more broadly the changes that took the transformation in Kenmore Square. And that's very much related to, processes of gentrification and real estate speculation. And, of course, this is an important element of the story, and a really important element of the story of the transformation of Boston and Cambridge is the rise of what we might consider the university industrial complex, right? And in the case of Kenmore Square, particularly Boston University. And so today, if you go by where the Rat was, well, that building's gone, and now it's a luxury hotel. And in some ways that says it all. But there's a lot of great memories associated with the Rat.
Yeah, I moved to Boston originally in 1997, and I got to go to all of one show at the Rat, one of the last ones before it closed. That was the first place where Bostonians actually talked to me. I think the first Bostonian who would deign to have a conversation with me was Mr. Butch, which listeners of a certain age will know Mr. Butch as sort of a prophet of the punk scene, a homeless Rasta guy. And everybody else at the Rat was too cool for me. But Mr. Butch had a nice little chat. So the book is A People's Guide to Greater Boston. It's available for pre-order and digital download now. It'll be out in physical copies later this week. We'll make sure to link to all the information you need to get a virtual or physical copy in this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/192. Now, besides the book, if folks want to know more about you or your work or keep up with you, is there any place online they should be looking for that?
There are two places right now. One would be a website that we're about to launch called bostonbook.org. Despite the name, it's a rather unpretentious website. But we also have a Facebook page called Greater Boston Book. That's a place where we share news, comment on current events, as well as highlight some of the sites we address in the book and wish we had addressed.
And I should say that the bostonbook.org, one of the things that we'll do on that site is post a lot of the sites that we wrote about but did not include in the book, sites that we will write about in the future. Right? This is an ongoing project for us. As we said, we don't see this as the final word. It's part of a larger conversation, but it's not our final word either. We want to continue thinking about this and writing and researching on this topic, and that will be one place where it unfolds.
All right. We'll also include a link to the website and the Facebook profile in this week's show notes. Joe and Suren, I just want to say thanks very much to both of you for joining me today and for spending the time to talk Boston history.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you, Jake. It's been a really great pleasure, and we really appreciate your interest and engagement.
To learn more about A People's History of Greater Boston, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/192. We'll have a link to buy the book, of course. And I'll also be sure to have links to bostonbook.org, as well as the Facebook page for the book. And of course, we'll have more information about the Athenaeum's Hamilton Remix virtual talk, this week's upcoming historical event. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop us a line, and we'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.